Introduction to ISOServer 2000. The goal of this nugget is simple. By the time you're done here, you will understand what ISOServer is and how it could apply to your network. And I'm going to do that through four major objectives. First off, I'm going to introduce what ISOServer 2000 is. What does it mean to you? And when you hear Microsoft refer to ISOServer, they usually call it the ISO Web Caching and Firewall Server. Well, what does that marketing garb mean? What is web caching and what is a firewall? Because when a lot of people think of a firewall, they think of going down to CompUSA and picking up one of those Linksys routers that has the built-in firewall. Is this the same thing? Does it give us any more options? Does it do anything else? We'll talk about that. Finally, it doesn't matter whether your network has a single internet connection that's maybe using DSL, or it could be a huge network with hundreds of locations around the world. ISOServer could be used in either one of those deployments. We'll look at some of the deployment scenarios and how we would use it in each. So let's start with the obvious question. What is the ISOServer? Well, overall, it's a piece of software that installs on any Windows 2000 or 2003 server platform that acts as a gateway between your internal network and the internet. And when you install the ISOServer, you get the following benefits. Number one is web caching. This allows you to store content from the internet locally on your ISOServer. Imagine this. You have 100 users on your internal network, and I'll represent those 100 users with this one computer right here. Like standard users, every morning at about 8 a.m., they'll open their web browser and download CNN.com or USA Today. What that would mean without the ISOServer in place is that they would go to the internet 100 times to get that content, even though it's the same content again and again and again. The ISOServer can store that content locally, so for the 99 extra accesses, it can retrieve it from its own hard drive rather than going out to the internet. That does two things. One is it saves your internet bandwidth in a big way. You don't have to go out to the internet 100 times. Two is from the perspective of those internal users, you have a killer internet connection because they're getting it at what? Probably 100 megabits per second if you're using a modern network interface and modern network switches. 100 megabit per second is really fast to start receiving that data into your web browser. Furthermore, ISOServer has improved on that. And they have features like active caching, and we'll talk about all of these in a future nugget. But active caching allows the ISOServer to become intelligent. It can predict what your users are going to do based on the traffic patterns of the past. It will see everybody going to CNN.com at 8 in the morning, and what it will do is learn that it can download CNN at 7:30 in the morning before anybody gets there to minimize that traffic load when everybody arrives. You can also do scheduled content download, which means you can say, well, at 1 o'clock a.m., I want to download the following sites, and go through that checklist of what you want to download locally for the next upcoming day. The second major benefit that we get with the ISOServer is a multi-layer firewall. I mentioned on the previous slide that I would tell you the difference between ISOServer and one of the D-Link or Linksys routers that you could pick up from CompUSA, and this is it. The ability to use it as a multi-layer firewall, meaning you can monitor at all 7 layers of the OSI model. Here's the scenario. We have a fairly technical user, represented by this squiggly face computer on our internal network. And at our company, we have a T3 line in place. Now this user might be downloading a ton of files using FTP because they realize they can get them much faster here than they could at home. That wastes our valuable internet bandwidth. So we might think, well, I want to put a firewall in place for my internal users, and I want to block anything going out on TCP port 21. That's what a standard firewall can do. It can block port numbers. But this is a technical user. You can tell by his face there. He knows that at some points and some FTP servers that he accesses on the internet, the port numbers are different. Maybe they're 210 or 2100 or some other port number that's in the valid TCP range. Well, if they change the port number for the outgoing request, then our firewall becomes invalid. But not with IsaServer. At IsaServer, instead of saying block port 21, we can say block FTP. And it can monitor at the application layer and recognize FTP traffic on any port number that is going out. At that point, the user can no longer change the port number to get out to the internet. They are blocked completely from using FTP across our network. That's one of the abilities that you can get with this multi-layer firewall. It also includes things like intrusion detection services, which detects virus attacks and worm attacks that have signatures to them. And we'll talk more about that in a future nugget. Some people deploy IsaServer only for the multi-layer firewall capabilities. The third thing that IsaServer allows you to have is called unified management. Imagine that we had a corporation with 4 locations. The top one is in Canada. The bottom 3 is Arizona, California, and Florida. Each location has its own IsaServer connecting to the internet. Now we'll say that Canada is the headquarters of this company. In Canada, you might have a corporate policy applied at the VP level that says at any location no more than 300 kilobits per second could be used for web traffic. We can actually deploy bandwidth restrictions using IsaServer. Now this corporate policy will replicate down to all the IsaServers at each location. And each location can develop its own policies. For example, California might block web traffic completely. Arizona might allow FTP traffic and web traffic, and Florida might have an internal email server that they allow access to from the outside. So they can create all their own policies as long as it doesn't violate the primary corporate policy. That's one of the features that you get when you deploy an IsaServer array, meaning multiple IsaServers combined under unified management. As a matter of fact, let me show you the console that we administer IsaServer from. Now I know we haven't gotten into the administration of IsaServer at all. I just want to show you how this unified management works. You see down here I have the ISA Management Console. I'm going to open that up, and this familiar view is the Microsoft Management Console, the MMC. And up here you see the ISA server, Internet Security and Acceleration, plugin for the MMC. Now right here I have the servers and arrays that I have installed, and so far I only have one server installed. It's not really an array because it is of type standalone. So I can come under here and I see my one server that I have installed so far. I expand this out and I see right here my access policies. This is where I can go if I wanted to start deploying policies for the entire array, or in this case just for this one server. If I did have an array set up, these policies would trickle down to all of the servers in that array, and I can set up different levels, such as the corporate policies or individual site policies one at a time, just like I was demonstrating on the previous slide. If there's one thing that Microsoft is good at, it's definitely this unified management structure. They have made IsaServer plug right into the management console, so the look and feel of that interface is going to be very easy to use. The final benefit that we see here is the extensibility of IsaServer. Microsoft has created this full-blown ISA SDK, software development kit. So you can actually create your own snap-ins and your own plugins for IsaServer to add functionality. As a matter of fact, there's many different third-party organizations that have already done this. As a matter of fact, let me take you to one of the coolest public websites that's available for IsaServer. It's isaserver.org. And I'm going to take you to their software section over here, which is pretty much vendors who have written plugins for IsaServer using the software development kit. Underneath here we have, you see, access control, 14 programs, antivirus, authentication. Let me just click on this access control. And underneath this you see all these different programs, the web filter, Sentian for Microsoft IsaServer. Yeah, some of them can cost some money. As we scroll down here, you see all of these third parties that have written plugins to make IsaServer even more feature-rific. So the extendability of ISA Server allows you to add plugins as later and greater utilities come out. Microsoft has released two versions of ISA Server, the Standard Edition and the Enterprise Edition, and here's the difference. The Standard Edition is meant for those small to medium businesses that have a single ISA server connected to the Internet protecting an internal network. Overall, this ISA server will have all the features that the Enterprise Edition has, except for the array management capabilities and anything that requires multiple ISA servers. The only time you need an Enterprise Edition of ISA servers is when you have multiple servers or multiple locations that are managed from that central source, kind of like that unified management example I just gave where we had Canada pushing out those centralized policies. This Enterprise Edition allows you to have those arrays and multiple levels of access policies and fault tolerance inside of your ISA server so that you can have more than one for those mission critical environments. So you can see I've taken you to the Microsoft website where it's comparing the Standard and the Enterprise Edition. And as you scroll through this list of features, you can get the feel that the Enterprise Edition is of course designed for large organizations that have multiple ISA servers in place. You have of course limited scalability, I love the marketing speak, hierarchical only for the hierarchical versus distributed caching. We'll talk about that feature in the caching nugget. We'll also have limited Active Directory integration. With Enterprise Edition, all your policies are fully stored in Active Directory so that they can replicate to all the different ISA servers. A tiered policy, which is the example I gave with the Canada and the lower level ISA servers in Arizona, Florida, and California. That's an ISA Server Enterprise feature, and the multi-server management is also the Enterprise Edition. So to give you the idea, Enterprise Edition is again for a multi-server environment. Regardless of the installation that you use, when you go to install the ISA server, you will have the option of one of three modes: cache, firewall, or integrated mode. Cache and firewall mode will dedicate the server to one of those two functions. If you install this in a cache mode, it will be a cache-only server. It has no firewall capabilities, no access control, nothing. If you install it as a firewall mode, it will only be a firewall and it will not be able to cache. Integrated brings both of those features, both the firewall and the cache, into one box. Now, I would say about 90% of the time, integrated mode will be what you use. And you might wonder, well, who would use cache or firewall mode only? That's usually the large organizations that have a decent budget when they're putting these things together, because they can dedicate servers to caching and dedicate servers to firewall. Because if you strip out caching functions or you strip out firewall and make it one or the other, you end up with a very efficient server. It's kind of a server that's geared directly for just one function, making it very good at that function. With integrated mode, yes, it is still very efficient. However, your resources on your server is divided between both the firewall and the cache features of the ISA server. Well, let's focus in on the caching features of the ISA server. Caching, again, allows the ISA server to store content from the Internet locally, we'll say CNN.com, so that as more users access it, it does not have to go to the Internet any longer. For example, after it was returned once here, the next PC to go to CNN.com only has to go to the ISA server. Now, there's some things to think about when you're looking at caching, like some websites change more often than others. Like CNN.com will probably be updated quite frequently. So what we can do is we can go into ISA server and specify that maybe CNN has a maximum cache time of 30 minutes. Now, some other websites like Datech.com are stock trading websites that need to be instantaneous. So we can put a no cache over the Datech so that anything from that website will not be cached on the ISA server. Also, from the Internet authoring perspective, People can specify in the HTML code of their web page that this content should not be cached. And thankfully, a lot of people, like the people at CNN.com, will go into their code and say, do not cache this. So when it's received at the ISIS server, it doesn't need any special configuration. It already sees that code and recognizes that it should not be cached. Furthermore, another thought with caching is that you can turn it on for FTP files. Matter of fact, it's on by default, which is really nice if you have a lot of people downloading the same files, but also can eat up a lot of hard drive space on your ISIS server if you don't watch out, and especially it loses its efficiency if people don't really download the same files via FTP. We'll look more into FTP and some of the strategies for caching in a future nugget, but these are just some caveats and things to consider when you're thinking about caching. When I initially thought of caching with the ISIS server, I thought of it just as I've been describing it so far, where we have the ISA server retrieving content from the internet for our internal clients so they don't have to go to the internet every single time. That is a valid mode, and it's called forward caching. But it is just one of the modes that's available. Reverse caching is just what it sounds like. If we have internal web servers on our local area network, there might be common pages that are accessed from the internet on those internal pages. For example, maybe we have a price list on our internal web server that people frequently access. Well, that can actually be cached on the ISIS server, I'll mark it with the I, so that the next time somebody comes to the web server, it doesn't need to go that far. The ISIS server can catch the request and bounce it back with a valid response. It can save a lot of the load on your internal web server, especially if it has a lot of frequently accessed pages. Now, distributed caching is a pretty wild feature. It allows your ISIS servers to work in conjunction with one another. Now, as soon as you see something like this, ISIS Server Enterprise Edition should come to mind, because we're combining the features of multiple ISIS servers. This is how it can work. Now, this is a rough example, and it doesn't work exactly like this, but it's close. We might have ISIS Server 1 over here on the left-hand side, and it can be designated dynamically through the array to cache web pages that start with A through H. The one in the middle might cache web pages that start with I through N. And the one on the right might cache web pages that start with O through Z. This allows it to become very efficient when it's caching the web pages, and it can give you a very speedy response when it's responding to an internal client request for one of those web pages. This is a way that we can combine not only the hard drive space, but the processing power of multiple web servers for a common goal. Turning our attention from the cache to the firewall considerations, we can control traffic entering the network from the internet, as well as we can control traffic leaving our network to the internet. And when we get to the firewall nugget, we will explore each one of these tools in depth. But just to give you a basic overview, the packet filters are what most people think of as a firewall, filtering on protocol and port numbers. Application filters can filter based on the type of application, like FTP or HTTP. Intrusion detection filters are awesome. They allow you to detect, based on certain signatures, types of worms and viruses that could be entering your ISIS server or into your network. Now, when you're leaving the network, you have some specific rules that you can deploy as well. Protocol rules saying not all protocols are created equal when they're leaving the network, meaning I can block some completely, or I can limit the bandwidth of some. Now, I also have the site and content rules that allow me to specify exactly what sites and what content is allowed. Get this. We can get this detailed. I can say not only you can only access this one site, but I can also say you can only access this content on this site. ISIS Server supports things like keyword filtering, so that when it sees certain words on web pages, it knows to block that content. It supports graphic and content filtering, saying, I only want to allow text through, no graphics, or vice versa. So you can get very detailed with exactly what sort of traffic leaves and comes in to your network through the firewall. Using the firewall and caching features, ISOServer can be deployed in any number of ways. This diagram right here is one of the simplest deployments that you can have. We have a single ISOServer that is standing as the single host between an internal network on the right-hand side and the external network on the left. Now, don't let me fool you. Just because I say this is a simple deployment doesn't mean this is one of those mom-and-pop shop sort of setups. This could easily support anywhere from 1 to in the range of 500 users, depending on what your company is and does and what they use the internet access for. I mean, overall, a single standalone ISOServer running the standard edition of the software can support a large number of users. Now, once you start growing beyond that or needing special functionality, that's where you might want to look at upgrading to one of the complex ISOServer designs. Please don't let my wording fool you. When I say complex, I just mean more complex than the simple design. Here's an example. In this case, we have an internet connection to a single ISOServer, and then in between these two ISOServers, we have what's called a DMZ. It stands for a demilitarized zone. And this allows us to have this kind of middle ground where we have hosts accessible from the outside. See, this is good because we don't have to open up holes in our internal network just to allow access to some hosts. This way, if somebody were to hack machines, they would be inside of the DMZ. And hopefully these machines don't contain too much mission-critical information. Those servers are going to be stored inside of our internal network, where the firewall deployed on the second level ISOServer is even more intense. There's a lot of consideration that goes into a design like this. There's a lot of thoughts like, do I cache here or cache here, or what direction do I cache, and what ports are going to be allowed to here, and will this web server be able to get into the internal network? Do I even allow access that way? This nugget isn't really meant to answer those kind of questions, just to get you thinking, because we'll look at all of these designs in full detail when we start looking at how we deploy a dual firewall scenario like you see in this slide. Here is a scenario where we're distributing the caching functions of ISOServers between 3 chained ISOServers. This allows us to have a level of fault tolerance and load distribution between all of these. I don't have it shown here, but we could easily split off the internet connection so that all of the ISOServers have access to that connection. So if one of them fails, we have 2 other ways out of the network and 2 other areas that have cached files. This allows us to centrally administer all of our caching and access restrictions through these ISOServers. Thanks to the ISO Management Console, we'll be able to administer all of these from a single location, but again, making your mind think a little bit, it can get pretty complex in the setup. I mean, imagine this is just caching. Let's turn on some firewall capabilities. Where's the DMZ go? Do we add another ISOServer over here? Will we switch these around and have 1 located up front and 3 behind? Or what's the best strategy? Well, never fear. As we go throughout this entire Nugget series, you will understand all of the pieces of ISOServer and how they fit together. So now that you're done with this nugget, you've seen what ISOServer 2000 is all about. You now know what web caching and the firewall capabilities of ISOServer really are, and what really makes ISOServer special when you're comparing it to other firewalls that are out on the market. Finally, we took a look at the different deployment scenarios that you could have ISOServer in, and there are many more than what we described here. These were designed just to get you thinking so you can see how ISOServer can be used. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.